The Sentinel of the Frozen Ridge. In the late winter of 2026, a team of 4 marine researchers was conducting a coastal biodiversity study along a remote, uninhabited stretch of the Haida Gwaii archipelago off the coast of British Columbia, Site 1. The expedition was focused on documenting the intertidal species in a series of hidden coves that are rarely visited due to their treacherous rocky approach. Site 1. The lead researcher, a biologist named Arthur Sterling, had worked in these waters for over 15 years and was intimately familiar with the rhythm of the Pacific tides and the constant, noisy activity of the local wildlife. Site 1. On the afternoon of May 19, while the team was documenting kelp beds in a secluded inlet, the environmental conditions shifted into a state of total sensory isolation that defied any known biological or atmospheric precedent. Site 1. The escalation began around 3 p.m. when the sound of the crashing surf, which had been a constant roar throughout the day, abruptly ceased. Site 1. It was not that the waves stopped moving, but rather that the sound they produced was no longer audible to the human ear. Site 1. Sterling and his 2 assistants looked at one another in a state of confusion, realizing that even the sounds of their own breathing and the splashing of their boots in the tide pools had vanished. Site 1. This auditory vacuum was accompanied by a strange visual phenomenon where the colors of the ocean and the surrounding cedar forest became hypersaturated, as if the light were being filtered through a lens that amplified every hue to an unnatural degree. Site 1. As the team attempted to communicate using hand signals, they discovered that their physical movements felt heavy and resistant, as if they were moving through a much denser medium than air. Site 1. The researchers reported seeing static in the atmosphere, tiny flickering sparks of white light that appeared to be dancing just above the surface of the water. Site 1. Sterling checked his handheld sonar device, which was designed to map the seabed. The screen displayed a solid, unmoving image of a terrain that did not match the cove they were standing in. Site 1. The device showed a series of deep, perfectly geometric trenches that seemed to pulse with a low-frequency energy, even though the actual seabed was composed of jagged, natural rock. Site 1. The team decided to retreat to their inflatable research vessel, but as they moved toward the shoreline, the distance seemed to fluctuate. Site 1. They would take several steps forward, only to find themselves further away from the boat than when they started. Site 1. During this period of spatial instability, the researchers witnessed a series of temporal ripples, short bursts of movement, where they saw the tide rapidly rise and fall within seconds, only for the water level to return to its original state moments later. Site 1. This disorientation was accompanied by a sharp, copper-like taste in their mouths and a persistent vibration in their chests that felt like a distant, rhythmic drumming. Site 1. By the time the team managed to reach their boat and pull away from the inlet, the sound of the ocean rushed back with a deafening force, causing several members to experience temporary vertigo. Site 1. When they returned to their primary research vessel and checked their digital logs, they discovered that while they perceived only 30 minutes of activity in the inlet, their GPS tracking data showed they had been stationary for nearly 6 hours. Site 1. The camera equipment used to document the tide pools was found to be completely blank. The files were not corrupted, but rather showed 0 bytes of data, as if the sensors had never been triggered, despite the team clearly remembering taking hundreds of high-resolution images. Site 1. Subsequent evaluations by a maritime safety board noted the equipment malfunctions, but offered no explanation for the localized silence or the time discrepancy. Site 1. The 3 researchers were found to be in good physical health, though all 3 suffered from a recurring dream in the following months of a geometric city resting beneath the waves of the archipelago. Site 1. Sterling eventually resigned from his position, stating that he could no longer view the ocean as a purely biological environment. Site 1. He became convinced that certain parts of the Haida Gwaii coast acted as a natural mute button for reality, where the laws of physics were occasionally suspended by forces that remained invisible to human technology. Site 1. The incident in the inlet remains an unofficial legend among the researchers who frequent the northern Pacific coast. Site 1. It is a case that highlights the fragility of human perception when confronted with an environment that refuses to behave according to the rules of the known world. Site 1. The Haida Gwaii archipelago, with its deep history and rugged landscape, continues to be a place of immense beauty and occasional terrifying silence. Site 1. The 2021 encounter stands as a reminder that even in the most well-documented corners of the globe, there are still pockets of existence where time, sound, and space can simply cease to function, leaving those who wander into them to grapple with a version of the world that has no voice. Site 1. Another instance of such environmental fragility occurred in the late summer of 2024, involving a trio of wilderness research scientists conducting a study on the Australian Alps. Site 1. The team, led by geophysicist Dr. Julian Thorne, was positioned on a jagged, unnamed ridge near the border of New South Wales and Victoria. Site 1. They were equipped with high-precision seismometers and satellite-linked data loggers to map the tectonic signatures of the continent's. Site 1. On the afternoon of February 12, the conditions on the ridge transformed in a way that deviated from any recorded seismic or atmospheric event. Site 1. The disturbance began at 4:15 p.m. when the sun appeared to split into three distinct identical spheres of light in the western sky. Site 1. Thorne initially suspected a perihelion, but the three suns remained fixed as the air grew unnaturally still and temperatures plummeted from 28 degrees Celsius to near freezing in minutes. Site 1. The researchers found their physical coordination severely compromised. One technician reported his sense of weight had inverted, making him feel pushed toward the sky while his feet remained on the ground. Site 1. A sound like shattering glass echoed through the rocks, yet seismometers showed no ground movement. Site 1. When the team tried to use their satellite phone, it connected to a recording of their own conversation 3 hours prior, played back in a distorted cadence. Site 1. The ridge began to glow with a bioluminescent violet and blue light. Site 1. They witnessed ghost landscapes where the ridge was replaced by a vast, shallow sea filled with pulsing organisms. Site 1. Thorne even reported seeing his own shadow move independently before dissolving into the violet light. Site 1. By 8 p.m., the phenomenon vanished, but their data loggers had recorded 48 hours of data in just 4 hours. Site 1. The soil samples collected turned into a white powder with a high electrical charge and a crystalline structure that matched no known terrestrial mineral. Site 1. The researchers developed synesthesia, a condition where they could see sounds and hear colors, which doctors could not explain. Site 1. This event, later classified as a localized atmospheric and magnetic anomaly, suggested that the ridge was running multiple versions of reality simultaneously. Site 1. It remains a chilling reminder that the Earth may possess a memory that can be violently replayed under specific conditions. Site 1. A similar encounter was reported in the Quartz Valley of the Northern Territory in Australia during the early summer of 2025. Site 1. A team led by geologist Dr. Helena Vance was installing autonomous sensors when a total auditory vacuum descended on the valley at 3:30 p.m. Site 1. The sound of their mechanical drill bit was silenced even as it continued to spin into the rock. Site 1. Geometric shapes composed of fractured light hovered above the ground, and the researchers experienced a total loss of spatial orientation, feeling the ground become a vertical wall. Site 1. During this sensory suppression, the team saw temporal echoes of themselves, low-resolution versions, performing tasks from the past and the future. Site 1. While they perceived hours had passed, only 12 minutes had elapsed in the world outside Site 1. The core sample they had been drilling transformed into a solid pillar of translucent glass, and their steel tools were physically aged and rusted as if decades had passed Site 1. The researchers returned with silver dust embedded in their pores and hair that had grown as if weeks had gone by Site 1. The digital logs from this incident contained no tectonic data, only a looping audio file of rhythmic, metallic breathing Site 1. Dr. Vance resigned, claiming a permanent sensitivity to a low-frequency hum she felt in her bones Site 1. The Quartz Valley remains a restricted zone, a place where the landscape acted as a catalyst for a reality-warping event Site 1. These three incidents in Haida Gwaii, the Australian Alps, and the Quartz Valley represent a growing archive of high-strangeness events where the primary threat is not an entity, but a fundamental shift in the environment itself. Site 1. The consistency of these reports across different geographies suggests a global phenomenon where certain mineral-rich locations act as rifts in the standard laws of physics. Site 1. Whether it is the magnetite of the Canadian coast or the quartz of the Australian outback, the Earth appears to harbor pockets where time and space are not constant. Site 1. The survivors of these events are left unanchored from the present, forced to live in a world that they now know to be far more fragile and complex than any map can suggest. Site 1. The silence of these remote places is not an absence of sound, but a presence of something older and more indifferent to human life. Site 1. The silent coast of the Haida Gwaii. In the late spring of 2021, a team of marine researchers was conducting a coastal biodiversity study along a remote, uninhabited stretch of the Haida Gwaii archipelago off the coast of British Columbia. The expedition was focused on documenting the intertidal species in a series of hidden coves that are rarely visited due to their treacherous rocky approach. The lead researcher, a biologist named Arthur Sterling, had worked in these waters for over 15 years and was intimately familiar with the rhythm of the Pacific tides and the constant, noisy activity of the local wildlife. On the afternoon of May 19th, while the team was documenting kelp beds in a secluded inlet, the environmental conditions shifted into a state of total sensory isolation that defied any known biological or atmospheric precedent. The escalation began around 3 p.m. when the sound of the crashing surf, which had been a constant roar throughout the day, abruptly ceased. It was not that the waves stopped moving, but rather that the sound they produced was no longer audible to the human ear. Sterling and his two assistants looked at one another in a state of confusion, realizing that even the sounds of their own breathing and the splashing of their boots in the tide pools had vanished. This auditory vacuum was accompanied by a strange visual phenomenon where the colors of the ocean and the surrounding cedar forest became hyper-saturated, as if the light were being filtered through a lens that amplified every hue to an unnatural degree. As the team attempted to communicate using hand signals, they discovered that their physical movements felt heavy and resistant, as if they were moving through a much denser medium than air. The researchers reported seeing static in the atmosphere, tiny flickering sparks of white light that appeared to be dancing just above the surface of the water. Sterling checked his handheld sonar device, which was designed to map the seabed, but the screen displayed a solid, unmoving image of a terrain that did not match the cove they were standing in. The device showed a series of deep, perfectly geometric trenches that seemed to pulse with a low-frequency energy, even though the actual seabed was composed of jagged, natural rock. The team decided to retreat to their inflatable research vessel, but as they moved toward the shoreline, the distance seemed to fluctuate. They would take several steps forward, only to find themselves further away from the boat than when they started. During this period of spatial instability, the researchers witnessed a series of temporal ripples, short bursts of movement where they saw the tide rapidly rise and fall within seconds, only for the water level to return to its original state moments later. This disorientation was accompanied by a sharp, copper-like taste in their mouths, and a persistent vibration in their chests that felt like a distant rhythmic drumming. By the time the team managed to reach their boat and pull away from the inlet, the sound of the ocean rushed back with a deafening force, causing several members to experience temporary vertigo. When they returned to their primary research vessel and checked their digital logs, they discovered that while they perceived only 30 minutes of activity in the inlet, their GPS tracking data showed they had been stationary for nearly 6 hours. The camera equipment used to document the tide pools was found to be completely blank. The files were not corrupted, but rather showed 0 bytes of data as if the sensors had never been triggered, despite the team clearly remembering taking hundreds of high-resolution images. Subsequent evaluations by a maritime safety board noted the equipment malfunctions, but offered no explanation for the localized silence or the time discrepancy. The 3 researchers were found to be in good physical health, though all 3 suffered from a recurring dream in the following months of a geometric city resting beneath the waves of the archipelago. Sterling eventually resigned from his position, stating that he could no longer view the ocean as a purely biological environment. He became convinced that certain parts of the Haida Gwaii coast acted as a natural mute button for reality, where the laws of physics were occasionally suspended by forces that remained invisible to human technology. The incident in the inlet remains an unofficial legend among the researchers who frequent the northern Pacific coast. It is a case that highlights the fragility of human perception when confronted with an environment that refuses to behave according to the rules of the known world. The Haida Gwaii archipelago, with its deep history and rugged landscape, continues to be a place of immense beauty and occasional terrifying silence. The 2021 encounter stands as a reminder that even in the most well-documented corners of the globe, there are still pockets of existence where time, sound, and space can simply cease to function, leaving those who wander into them to grapple with a version of the world that has no voice. The standing stones of the Nahan Valley. In the late summer of 2017, a small team of topographic surveyors was contracted to map a remote, unnamed valley in the northern reaches of British Columbia, Canada, Site 1. The area was characterized by its extreme isolation and a geological profile that featured high concentrations of magnetite and quartz, Site 1. The crew, led by a veteran surveyor named Thomas Vance, had spent decades working in the Canadian wilderness and were accustomed to the physical and mental demands of deep country fieldwork, Site 1. On the 4th day of their expedition, while establishing a baseline near the valley floor, the team encountered an atmospheric shift that deviated from any known meteorological or geological process, Site 1. The disturbance began as a subtle, low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate through the ground rather than the air, Site 1. Initially, Vance suspected it was mechanical interference from their own generator, but the sound persisted even after all power sources were manually disconnected, Site 1. As the hum increased in intensity, the team witnessed a localized suppression of all natural biological activity, Site 1. The wind died down completely, and the birds and insects that had been active moments before went silent, Site 1. The observers reported that the air in the center of the valley appeared to thicken, creating a visual effect similar to heat haze, despite the cool, overcast conditions, Site 1. As the surveyors attempted to continue their work, they discovered that their sense of direction and spatial awareness had been compromised, Site 1. Their high-precision digital compasses began to drift in a slow, clockwise rotation, and their laser-ranging equipment failed to return a reading, as if the light were being absorbed by the air itself, Site 1. The men reported a feeling of intense nausea and a pressure in their temples that felt like a localized atmospheric spike, Site 1. They decided to backtrack to their base camp, but the terrain seemed to extend and warp Site 1. A distance that should have taken 10 minutes to cover took nearly an hour of strenuous effort, as the horizon seemed to shimmer and retreat whenever they moved toward it, Site 1. During their retreat, the team witnessed a series of visual anomalies described as shimmering panes in the air. Site 1. These were vertical sections of the atmosphere that appeared to reflect a different landscape, one consisting of jagged, crystalline formations and a sky of a deep, bruised purple visible for only a few seconds before snapping back to the rocky valley floor. Site 1. These windows were accompanied by a sharp metallic taste that coated their tongues and a persistent vibration in their teeth. Site 1. The group huddled together, overwhelmed by a feeling of intense surveillance, though no physical entities or craft were reported. Site 1. The peak of the incident occurred around midnight when the team, finally having reached their camp, found that all of their electronic equipment had been drained of power. Site 1. Every battery-operated device was dead, and the vehicle's ignition failed to turn. Site 1. They sat in the dark, watching as a pale, bioluminescent glow began to crawl out of the ground near the valley's center. Site 1. This light cast no shadows and produced no heat, but as it touched the perimeter of their camp, the low-frequency hum reached a pitch that caused the men to cover their ears in pain. Site 1. They reported a profound distortion of time, where what felt like a few minutes of observation turned out to be several hours of real-time passage. Site 1. By the first light of dawn, the phenomenon vanished as abruptly as it had begun. Site 1. The electronic devices regained their charge instantly, and the vehicle started on the first turn of the key. Site 1. However, the physical landscape showed signs of a significant energetic event. Site 1. Within the area where the hum had been most intense, the vegetation had been bleached of all color, turning a ghostly, brittle white. Site 1. The soil was covered in a fine, silver-colored dust that dissolved into an oily residue when touched. Site 1. Subsequent medical evaluations revealed that the men had undergone a strange physiological change. Their cellular aging appeared to have accelerated, and they suffered from a persistent sensitivity to electromagnetic fields. Site 1. The official report filed by the survey company noted the equipment failures and the bleached vegetation, but offered no explanation for the hum or the spatial distortions. Site 1. Regional authorities categorized the event as an unspecified geological resonance incident, a bureaucratic label that ignored the missing time and the visual pains. Site 1. The valley was never officially investigated, and Vance and his team refused to return to the site, citing a permanent loss of confidence in their ability to trust their senses in the deep wild. Site 1. The incident remains a localized mystery, documented only in professional journals and regional archives of unexplained occurrences in the Canadian North. Site 1. Today, the valley remains an unnamed spot on the map, avoided by local hikers and hunters who speak of the Singing Ground. Site 1. The mystery of the hum and the white trees remains unresolved, a cold reminder of the potential for the natural world to exhibit behaviors that defy human logic and measurement. Site 1. The 2014 incident stands as a chilling example of an environmental haunting, where the primary threat is not a physical entity, but a fundamental shift in the environment itself. Site 1. The forest has since reclaimed the area, but the memory of the night the earth vibrated and the light bled from the stones remains a permanent gap in the lives of the men who survived it. Site 1. The vanishing of the Black Ridge Camp. In the late summer of 2025, a small team of 4 environmental researchers was dispatched to a remote, unnamed valley in the high-altitude regions of the Northern Territory in Australia. Site 1. The valley was known to local geological surveys for its unusually high concentrations of crystalline quartz and magnetite, which often caused minor compass deviations. Site 1. The team was led by an experienced field geologist named Dr. Helena Vance, who had spent over 20 years mapping the magnetic anomalies of the Australian outback. Site 1. Their objective was to install a series of autonomous sensors to monitor long-term tectonic shifts. Site 1. On the afternoon of June 14, the team experienced an environmental event that fundamentally challenged their scientific training. Site 1. The disturbance began at approximately 3:30 p.m., while the researchers were drilling a core sample near a large quartz outcropping Site 1. The sound of the drill, which had been a constant mechanical roar, was suddenly and completely silenced. Site 1. It was not that the machine had stopped working. The drill bit was still visibly spinning into the rock, but the sound simply failed to travel through the air. Site 1. Within seconds, all ambient noise, including the wind and the voices of the team members, vanished into a total auditory vacuum. Site 1. Doctor. Vance reported that even the internal sounds of her own body, such as her heartbeat and the rush of air in her lungs, became inaudible to her. Site 1. As the team attempted to signal one another using hand gestures, they noticed a visual phenomenon occurring at the center of the valley. Site 1. The air began to shimmer and fold, creating a series of translucent geometric shapes that hovered just above the ground. Site 1. These shapes appeared to be composed of fractured light, resembling the internal structure of a quartz crystal magnified thousands of times. Site 1. As the light intensified, the researchers experienced a profound loss of spatial orientation. Site 1. The ground beneath their feet felt as though it had become a vertical wall, while the distant ridgelines seemed to press down on them from above. Site 1. This vestibular collapse was accompanied by a sharp metallic scent that filled the air, smelling of scorched ozone. Site 1. During the height of the sensory suppression, the team witnessed a series of temporal echoes. Site 1. They reported seeing faint, low-resolution versions of themselves performing the drilling task from an hour prior, while simultaneously seeing another set of echoes packing up the camp for a departure that was not scheduled for another 2 days. Site 1. These figures moved with a jarring, stop-motion cadence, occasionally emerging with the present-day researchers before dissolving into the shimmering air. Site 1. Doctor. Vance looked at her mechanical watch and saw that the second hand was vibrating rapidly in place, unable to move forward, while the digital data loggers on the sensors began to count backward at an impossible speed. Site 1. The incident lasted for what felt like several hours to the participants, but when the sound finally rushed back into the environment, it did so with the force of a physical explosion. Site 1. The team was knocked to the ground by a sudden atmospheric pressure wave that shattered the lenses of their surveying equipment. Site 1. When they managed to stand and check their satellite-linked chronometers, they discovered that only 12 minutes had passed in the world outside the valley. Site 1. However, the physical evidence of their experience was undeniable. Site 1. The core sample they had been drilling was found to have been transformed into a solid pillar of translucent glass, and the steel drill bit had been physically aged, covered in a thick layer of rust that would normally take decades to form. Site 1. Upon returning to their base station, the team underwent comprehensive medical screenings. Site 1. All 4 researchers exhibited a strange biological anomaly. Their hair and fingernails had grown as if 3 weeks had passed, yet their skin showed signs of mild radiation-like redness, and a fine, silver dust was embedded in their pores. Site 1. The digital data loggers, when analyzed, contained no tectonic data. Instead, they were filled with a single looping audio file that sounded like a rhythmic metallic breathing, punctuated by the sound of shattering glass. Site 1. The official report filed with the Geological Survey listed the event as a localized electromagnetic and temporal resonance incident, a term that failed to explain the visual pains or the aged equipment. Site 1. The valley has since been designated as a restricted zone for further environmental study, though no official government team has returned to the site. Site 1. Doctor. Vance resigned from her position shortly after the debriefing, claiming that the experience had left her with a permanent sensitivity to the rhythm of the Earth, which she described as a constant, low-frequency hum that she could feel in her bones. Site 1. The other researchers reported a persistent condition where they would occasionally see the world in a monochromatic palette for brief intervals, a visual flashback to the sensory vacuum of the valley, Site 1. The mystery of the Quartz Valley remains a significant point of discussion in the archives of Australian Unexplained Phenomena, Site 1. It represents a case where the landscape itself acted as a catalyst for a reality-warping event, likely triggered by the unique combination of mineral concentrations and atmospheric pressure, Site 1. There were no entities, no crafts, and no messages. Only the terrifying realization that the physical laws of the universe are not as stable as they appear, Site 1. The glass core sample remains in a secure facility, a silent witness to the 12 minutes that lasted a lifetime, and the valley remains empty, guarding its silence and its shimmering light beneath the vast, indifferent sky of the Northern Territory Site. 1. The Void of the Quartz Valley. In the early summer of 2025, a small team of 4 environmental researchers was dispatched to a remote, unnamed valley in the high-altitude regions of the Northern Territory, Australia. The valley was known to local geological surveys for its unusually high concentrations of crystalline quartz and magnetite, which often caused minor compass deviations. The team was led by an experienced field geologist, Dr. Vance, who had spent over 20 years mapping the magnetic anomalies of the Australian outback. Their objective was to install a series of autonomous sensors to monitor long-term tectonic shifts. On the afternoon of June 14, the team experienced an environmental event that fundamentally challenged their scientific training. The disturbance began at approximately 3:30 p.m. while the researchers were drilling a core sample near a large quartz outcropping. The sound of the drill, which had been a constant mechanical roar, was suddenly and completely silenced. It was not that the machine had stopped working. The drill bit was still visibly spinning into the rock, but the sound simply failed to travel through the air. Within seconds, all ambient noise, including the wind and the voices of the team members, vanished into a total auditory vacuum. Dr. Vance reported that even the internal sounds of her own body, such as her heartbeat and the rush of air in her lungs, became inaudible to her. As the team attempted to signal one another using hand gestures, they noticed a visual phenomenon occurring at the center of the valley. The air began to shimmer and fold, creating a series of translucent, geometric shapes that hovered just above the ground. These shapes appeared to be composed of fractured light, resembling the internal structure of a quartz crystal magnified thousands of times. As the light intensified, the researchers experienced a profound loss of spatial orientation. The ground beneath their feet felt as though it had become a vertical wall, while the distant ridge lines seemed to press down on them from above. This vestibular collapse was accompanied by a sharp, metallic scent that filled the air, smelling of scorched ozone. During the height of the sensory suppression, the team witnessed a series of temporal echoes. They reported seeing faint, low-resolution versions of themselves performing the drilling task from an hour prior, while simultaneously seeing another set of echoes packing up the camp for a departure that was not scheduled for another 2 days. These figures moved with a jarring stop-motion cadence, occasionally merging with the present-day researchers before dissolving into the shimmering air. Doctor? Vance looked at her mechanical watch and saw that the second hand was vibrating rapidly in place, unable to move forward, while the digital data loggers on the sensors began to count backward at an impossible speed. The incident lasted for what felt like several hours to the participants, but when the sound finally rushed back into the environment, it did so with the force of a physical explosion. The team was knocked to the ground by a sudden atmospheric pressure wave that shattered the lenses of their surveying equipment. When they managed to stand and check their satellite-linked chronometers, they discovered that only 12 minutes had passed in the world outside the valley. However, the physical evidence of their experience was undeniable. The core sample they had been drilling was found to have been transformed into a solid pillar of translucent glass, and the steel drill bit had been physically aged, covered in a thick layer of rust that would normally take decades to form. Upon returning to their base station, the team underwent comprehensive medical screenings. All 4 researchers exhibited a strange biological anomaly. Their hair and fingernails had grown as if 3 weeks had passed, yet their skin showed signs of mild radiation-like redness, and a fine, silver dust was embedded in their pores. The digital data loggers, when analyzed, contained no tectonic data. Instead, they were filled with a single, looping audio file that sounded like a rhythmic, metallic breathing, punctuated by the sound of shattering glass. The official report filed with the Geological Survey listed the event as a localized electromagnetic and temporal resonance incident, a term that failed to explain the visual pains or the aged equipment. The valley has since been designated as a restricted zone for further environmental study, though no official government team has returned to the site. Dr. Vance resigned from her position shortly after the briefing, claiming that the experience had left her with a permanent sensitivity to the rhythm of the Earth, which she described as a constant, low-frequency hum that she could feel in her bones. The other researchers reported a persistent condition where they would occasionally see the world in a monochromatic palette for brief intervals, a visual flashback to the sensory vacuum of the valley. The mystery of the Quartz Valley remains a significant point of discussion in the archives of Australian unexplained phenomena. It represents a case where the landscape itself acted as a catalyst for a reality-broken event, likely triggered by the unique combination of mineral concentrations and atmospheric pressure. There were no entities, no crafts, and no messages, only the terrifying realization that the physical laws of the universe are not as stable as they appear. The glass core sample remains in a secure facility, a silent witness to the 12 minutes that lasted a lifetime, and the valley remains empty, guarding its silence and its shimmering light beneath the vast, indifferent sky of the Northern Territory. The Whispering Ridge of the Great Divide. In the late winter of 2026, a team of 4 marine researchers was conducting a coastal biodiversity study along a remote, uninhabited stretch of the Haida Gwaii archipelago off the coast of British Columbia, Site 1. The expedition was focused on documenting intertidal species in a series of hidden coves that are rarely visited due to their treacherous rocky approach. Site 1. The lead researcher, a biologist named Arthur Sterling, had worked in these waters for over 15 years and was intimately familiar with the rhythm of the Pacific tides and the constant, noisy activity of marine wildlife. Site 1. On the afternoon of May 19, while the team was documenting kelp beds in a secluded inlet, the environmental conditions shifted into a state of total sensory isolation that defied any known biological or atmospheric precedent. Site 1. The escalation began around 3 p.m. when the sound of the crashing surf, which had been a constant roar throughout the day, abruptly ceased. Site 1. It was not that the waves stopped moving, but rather that the sound they produced was no longer audible to the human ear. Site 1. Sterling and his 2 assistants looked at one another in a state of confusion, realizing that even the sounds of their own breathing and the splashing of their boots in the tide pools had vanished. Site 1. This auditory vacuum was accompanied by a strange visual phenomenon where the colors of the ocean and the surrounding cedar forest became hyper-saturated, as if the light were being filtered through a lens that amplified every hue to an unnatural degree. Site 1. As the team attempted to communicate using hand signals, they discovered that their physical movements felt heavy and resistant, as if they were moving through a much denser medium than air. Site 1. The researchers reported seeing static in the atmosphere, tiny flickering sparks of white light that appeared to be dancing just above the surface of the water. Site 1. Sterling checked his handheld sonar device, which was designed to map the seabed, but the screen displayed a solid, unmoving image of a terrain that did not match the cove they were standing in. Site 1. The device showed a series of deep, perfectly geometric trenches that seemed to pulse with a low-frequency energy, even though the actual seabed was composed of jagged natural rock, Site 1. The team decided to retreat to their inflatable research vessel, but as they moved toward the shoreline, the distance seemed to fluctuate, Site 1. They would take several steps forward, only to find themselves further away from the boat than when they started Site 1. During this period of spatial instability, the researchers witnessed a series of temporal ripples, short bursts of movement where they saw the tide rapidly rise and fall within seconds, only for the water level to return to its original state moments later. Site 1. This disorientation was accompanied by a sharp, copper-like taste in their mouths and a persistent vibration in their chests that felt like a distant, rhythmic drumming. Site 1. By the time the team managed to reach their boat and pull away from the inlet, the sound of the ocean rushed back with a deafening force, causing several members to experience temporary vertigo. Site 1. When they returned to their primary research vessel and checked their digital logs, they discovered that while they perceived only 30 minutes of activity in the inlet, their GPS tracking data showed they had been stationary for nearly 6 hours. Site 1. The camera equipment used to document the tide pools was found to be completely blank. The files were not corrupted, but rather showed 0 bytes of data as if the sensors had never been triggered, despite the team clearly remembering taking hundreds of high-resolution images. Site 1. Subsequent evaluations by a maritime safety board noted the equipment malfunctions but offered no explanation for the localized silence or the time discrepancy. Site 1. The 3 researchers were found to be in good physical health, though all 3 suffered from a recurring dream in the following months of a geometric city resting beneath the waves of the archipelago. Site 1. Sterling eventually resigned from his position, stating that he could no longer view the ocean as a purely biological environment. Site 1. He became convinced that certain parts of the Haida Gwaii coast acted as a natural mute button for reality, where the laws of physics were occasionally suspended by forces that remained invisible to human technology. Site 1. This specific coastal anomaly mirrored another event of geographical instability that occurred in the Australian Alps during the late autumn of 2024. Site 1. A research team led by Dr. Rao. Julian Thorne was positioned on a jagged, unnamed ridge near the border of New South Wales and Victoria when the sun appeared to split into 3 identical spheres of light. Site 1. The temperature dropped from 28 degrees Celsius to near freezing in 3 minutes, and the researchers experienced inverted gravity, feeling as though they were being pushed toward the sky while their feet remained glued to the granite. Site 1. Seismometers recorded no ground movement despite a deafening sound like shattering glass emanating from the rocks beneath them. Site 1. The digital equipment used by Thorne's team recorded 48 hours of data in a 4-hour span, and soil samples were transformed into a highly charged white powder. Site 1. The researchers involved in the Alps incident, known as the Red Peak dislocation, developed synesthesia, allowing them to hear colors and see sounds. Site 1. This suggested that the environment was running multiple versions of reality simultaneously. Site 1. Similarly, in the Quartz Valley of the Northern Territory in 2025, a team led by Dr. Helena Vance experienced a total auditory vacuum where even a spinning mechanical drill produced no sound. Site 1. They witnessed geometric light shapes and temporal echoes of themselves, while the physical world outside progressed at a different speed. Site 1. In the Quartz Valley case, only 12 minutes passed for the outside world, but the researchers returned with several weeks of hair and fingernail growth and aged, rusted equipment. Site 1. The core sample they had been drilling was transformed into a solid pillar of translucent glass, and their digital logs contained no data other than a looping audio file of rhythmic, metallic breathing. Site 1. These survivors returned with silver dust embedded in their pores and suffered from a persistent sensitivity to a low-frequency hum. Site 1. Like Dr. Sterling in British Columbia, Dr. Vance eventually resigned, unable to reconcile her scientific training with the reality-warping event she had witnessed. Site 1. The consistency of high strangeness across these geographies, Haida Gwaii, the Australian Alps, and the Quartz Valley, indicates a global phenomenon tied to mineral-rich locations. Site 1. Whether involving the magnetite of Canada or the crystalline quartz of the Australian outback, these sites seem to act as catalysts for environmental hauntings where time and space are not constant. Site 1. The survivors frequently report physical markers like silver dust and a lingering feeling of being unanchored from linear time. Site 1. These accounts form a growing archive of incidents where the primary threat is not a confirmed crime or entity, but a fundamental shift in the landscape itself. Site 1. The mystery of why these events occur remains unsolved, as no man-made causes have ever been identified. Site 1. The 2026 Haida Gwaii encounter serves as a foundational case for modern studies into environmental sensory isolation and localized physics failures. Site 1. It serves as a reminder that there are still corners of the planet where the air, water, and earth do not follow human logic. Site 1. The coastline of the archipelago remains as rugged and beautiful as ever. But to the team that stood in that silent inlet, it is a place where the world once lost its voice and the ocean went still. Site 1. Independent investigators who studied the Red Peak site months after the 2024 event found that the white powder possessed a crystalline structure matching no known terrestrial mineral. Site 1. The granite outcrops showed microscopic fractures radiating from the central point, as if an invisible explosion of kinetic energy had occurred within the stone site. 1. These physical markers supported Dr. Thorne's theory of geographic trauma, which suggests that certain landscapes possess a memory that can violently replay under specific atmospheric conditions. Site 1. His belief was that the ridge was not haunted by the dead, but by ghosts of the Earth's history. Site 1. The 48 hours of data reported in a 4-hour window by Thorne's team provided numerical proof that time was not a constant in that wilderness. Site 1. This temporal field compression remains a point of intense discussion among those who study the fringes of geophysics. Site 1. Similarly, the glass core sample from the Quartz Valley incident remains in a secure facility, a silent witness to 12 minutes that lasted a lifetime. Site 1. These cases suggest that the Earth is a dynamic and perhaps sentient entity capable of folding the present back into the past whenever geological and magnetic fields align. Site 1. Today, these sites remain quiet and largely avoided by those who know their history. Site 1. No monuments mark the ridge in the Alps or the cove in Haida Gwaii, and no tours are conducted to the site of the Quartz Valley anomaly. Site 1. They remain places of deep silence, guarding secrets that refuse to be measured by standard technology. Site 1. For the researchers involved, these locations were where their understanding of the world began anew, leaving them forever marked by the realization that the ground beneath their feet is not nearly as solid or predictable as it appears. Site 1. The legacy of these environmental disruptions is recorded primarily in the margins of professional journals and the private diaries of the survivors. Site 1. These individuals live with the knowledge that the world is far older and more complex than our maps suggest. Site 1. The silence of the remote wild is not just an absence of sound, but a presence of something older and indifferent to human observation. Site 1. The 2026 incident in British Columbia, alongside its Australian counterparts, stands as a testament to the fact that the natural world still holds mysteries that defy measurement and logic. Site 1. The Whispering Wells of the Blackwood Plateau. In the spring of 2011, a small team of hydrologists was dispatched to a remote section of the Blackwood Plateau in the northern United States to to investigate a series of sudden, localized shifts in groundwater levels. The plateau is a desolate, high-altitude landscape characterized by thin soil and deep vertical fissures in the limestone bedrock. The lead researcher, a man named Dr. Aris Thorne, had spent years studying the subterranean plumbing of the region and was well-versed in the mechanical sounds of shifting Earth. However, what his team encountered near a cluster of abandoned hand-dug wells from the 19th century deviated from any known geological process. The escalation began during a routine acoustic survey of the well designated as Well 14. As the team lowered a high-sensitivity waterproof microphone into the shaft, they didn't hear the expected drip of water or the rush of underground currents. Instead, the recording equipment captured a rhythmic, pulsing sound that Thorne described as being remarkably similar to a slow, labored breath. This breathing was not a trick of the wind or air pressure changes. It was a consistent, low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. When the team reviewed the audio data later that night, they discovered that the pulse was perfectly synchronized with the atmospheric pressure cycles of the plateau, as if the Earth were literally inhaling and exhaling the air above it. The following morning, the team's physical environment began to present anomalies that challenged their spatial awareness. As they walked toward the well site, they reported that the horizon appeared to warp, with distant peaks seeming to move closer and then retreat within the span of a few steps. The sensation was described as walking on a liquid surface, where the ground remained solid to the touch but visually fluctuated. More disturbing was the auditory phenomenon that gave the wells their name. Multiple members of the team reported hearing hushed, sibilant whispers rising from the shafts. These weren't voices in a recognizable language, but a series of tonalities that mimicked the cadence of human conversation, often sounding like their own names being repeated back to them from the depths of the earth. The team attempted to leave the area when one of the researchers, a technician named Sarah, began to experience a severe loss of physical coordination. She reported that her sense of up and down had inverted, making it impossible for her to stand. While the other two members of the team tried to assist her, they witnessed a visual distortion where the sunlight hitting the limestone began to cast shadows in multiple directions at once, despite there being only one sun in the sky. The air around the wells grew unnaturally cold, dropping 20 degrees in a matter of seconds, and a fine gray mist began to rise from the fissures, smelling of ancient, stagnant minerals. During the peak of the incident, the team experienced a collective gap in their memory. They remembered huddling together near their vehicle at approximately 2 p.m., and the very next conscious moment they had was standing 3 miles away on the edge of the plateau at 6:45 p.m. Their equipment remained at the well site, but when they returned to retrieve it the next day, they found it had undergone a strange transformation. The metal casings of their sensors were covered in a translucent, glass-like coating that was fused to the surface, and the digital memory cards had been wiped completely, replaced with a single, looping audio file of the rhythmic breathing they had heard on the first day. Physiological after effects were documented by a regional health clinic where the team was evaluated for environmental exposure. All 3 individuals showed signs of localized cellular stress, and Dr. Thorne reported a persistent ringing in his ears that matched the frequency of the subterranean pulse. The technician, Sarah, suffered from a recurring vestibular imbalance that made her feel as though she were constantly falling, even when lying flat. The official report filed with the State Geological Survey listed the event as an unspecified seismic and atmospheric resonance incident, a term that failed to address the missing time, the whispers, or the glass-like coating on their gear. In the years following the 2011 encounter, the wells of the Blackwood Plateau have been largely avoided by state agencies. The few independent researchers who have ventured into the area have reported similar, though less intense, experiences of spatial disorientation and strange acoustic patterns. Local records from the 1800s were later discovered to contain warnings about the breathing ground, suggesting that the phenomenon is a recurring natural feature of the plateau's unique geology. The incident remains a cornerstone of regional unexplained phenomena, representing a rare case where the environment itself appears to exhibit a form of non-biological sentience or a localized rupture in the standard laws of physics. The mystery of the Whispering Wells lies in the lack of a traditional haunting or entity. There was no malevolent force, only a landscape that functioned on a logic that was entirely alien to the humans trying to map it. The team eventually moved on to other projects, but none of them ever returned to the high-altitude limestone in the north. They were left with the unsettling realization that beneath the silent, empty surface of the plateau, there is a process unfolding that is older than human history and indifferent to human observation. The wells remain deep and dark, exhaling the secrets of the earth into the thin, cold air. The Blackwood Light. In the late summer of 1991, an unsettling series of events occurred within the remote expanse of the Blackwood River Valley in Western Australia. The incident centered on a small team of topographic surveyors tasked with mapping a rugged, densely forested stretch of land roughly 40 miles east of Nana. The crew consisted of 3 men, led by a veteran surveyor named Thomas Vance, who had spent nearly 30 years working in the Australian bush. They were equipped with high-precision optical instruments and were accustomed to the physical and mental isolation that comes with deep country fieldwork. On the 3rd day of their expedition, the atmosphere of the valley underwent a shift that defied their collective experience and professional training. The escalation began during a standard late-afternoon sighting. Vance was peering through a theodolite, aiming at a marker held by his colleague David several hundred yards away across a narrow ravine. As the sun began to dip behind the carry trees, Vance reported seeing a sudden, localized distortion in the lens of his instrument. It wasn't a blur or a smudge, but a visual ripple that looked like heat haze, despite the rapidly cooling air. When he looked away from the eyepiece, he saw a pale bioluminescent glow emanating from the floor of the ravine. The light did not have a visible source. It seemed to bleed directly out of the soil and the decaying leaf litter. Within minutes, the glow had intensified, turning the shadowed floor of the ravine into a sea of cold, flickering white light that cast no shadows and produced no heat. The team attempted to communicate via their handheld radios, but the devices were suddenly rendered useless by a wall of deafening static. Even more disturbing was the physical sensation that accompanied the light. The men reported a feeling of profound weightlessness, as if the gravitational pull of the Earth had been slightly but perceptibly dialed back. This was followed by a sharp, ozone-like scent that filled the air, despite the lack of any storm activity or electrical equipment malfunctions. David, who was closest to the glowing center of the ravine, later described a sensation of being watched by something that was part of the atmosphere itself, a presence that felt vast, ancient, and entirely indifferent to human life. As the surveyors retreated toward their base camp, they discovered that their sense of direction had been completely compromised. The landmarks they had used only hours before specific rock formations and uniquely shaped trees seemed to have shifted positions. Even their compasses, which should have been reliable in the absence of known magnetic anomalies, began to drift slowly in a clockwise direction. The men found themselves walking in circles, returning to the same glowing ravine 3 times, despite their efforts to head north. Each time they returned, the light seemed to have grown taller, now reaching the lower branches of the trees and illuminating the forest with a clinical, unearthly brilliance that made the surrounding darkness feel like a solid wall. The peak of the incident occurred around midnight. The surveyors, having finally reached their camp, found that all of their electronic equipment had been drained of power. Every flashlight, camera battery, and vehicle ignition was dead. They sat in the dark, watching as the pale glow from the ravine began to crawl up the slope toward their tents. As the light touched the perimeter of their camp, The sound of the forest, the insects, the nocturnal birds, the wind was replaced by a low-frequency thrumming that resonated in their team's bones. One member of the team, a younger man named Simon, reported seeing the light coalesce into vague, shifting shapes that moved with a fluidity that was not biological. These shapes did not approach the men, but seemed to be performing a repetitive, ritualistic movement through the trees. The phenomenon persisted for approximately 4 hours. During this time, the men experienced a profound distortion of their internal clocks. What felt like minutes of observation turned out to be hours of real-time passage. When the light finally began to recede back into the earth, it did so with a sound like a long exhaled breath. By the first light of dawn, the forest had returned to its normal state. The radios functioned perfectly, the vehicle started on the first turn of the key, and the compasses pointed true north. However, the physical landscape told a different story. Within the area where the light had been most intense, the vegetation had been bleached of all color, turning a ghostly, brittle white. The soil was covered in a thin, crystalline powder that had vanished within an hour of being exposed to direct sunlight. Upon returning to Nanub, the team underwent medical examinations. While they were physically unharmed, Vance and David both exhibited a strange ocular condition where their pupils remained fully dilated for several days, regardless of light levels. Simon suffered from a persistent auditory hallucination, claiming he could still hear the low-frequency thrumming whenever he was in the quiet room. The official report filed by the survey company noted the equipment failures and the bleached vegetation, but offered no explanation for the light or the sensory distortions. Local indigenous elders, when questioned by researchers years later, referred to the area as a place where the earth skin was thin, a location where the physical world and another, less tangible reality occasionally overlapped. The Blackwood Light was never officially investigated by the government, as no crime had been committed and the incident occurred on Crown land with no civilian witnesses outside of the survey team. It remains a localized mystery, documented only in professional journals and regional archives of unexplained occurrences. The survey markers placed by the team that day are still there, but subsequent mapping efforts have noted that the coordinates in that specific sector of the valley are prone to small, inexplicable shifts over time. The men involved in the 1991 incident refused to return to the valley, and the company eventually rerouted its survey paths to avoid the ravine entirely. The incident is characterized by its lack of typical paranormal tropes. There were no ghosts, no crafts, and no messages. It was a purely environmental anomaly that suggested the natural world is capable of behaviors that remain entirely outside the scope of current scientific understanding. The bleached forest eventually recovered its color, but the trees in that section are said to grow slower than those around them, their wood unusually dense and difficult to cut. For Thomas Vance, the experience was a definitive end to his career in the bush. He retired shortly after, stating that he could no longer trust the ground beneath his feet to stay silent or the light in the sky to stay constant. Today, the Blackwood River Valley continues to be a popular spot for hikers and campers, most of whom are unaware of the events of 1991. Yet, occasionally, reports surface of hikers becoming strangely disoriented in the ravine of the white trees, or of cameras and phones losing all power for no apparent reason. The mystery of the light remains unresolved, a cold, flickering memory in the minds of 3 men who saw the forest floor come to life. It stands as a reminder that in the vast, ancient landscapes of Australia, there are still pockets of existence that operate on a timeline and a logic that humans were never meant to decipher. The Condon Encounter and the Forest of Lost Time. In the autumn of 1974, the dense timberlands of the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest in eastern Oregon became the backdrop for an incident that remains one of the most complex cases of reported temporal distortion in the Pacific Northwest. Unlike many stories that filter through local legends, this event was centered around a group of experienced outdoorsmen who were not looking for the unusual. They were a five-man party of hunters and woodsmen, led by a local resident named Robert Condon, who had spent decades navigating the rugged terrain near the Imnaha River. They knew the landmarks, the weather patterns, and the physical demands of the wilderness. On the morning of October 12, the group set out from a base camp near a high-altitude ridge, intending to scout a specific drainage area known for its heavy elk population. The weather was clear, the air was crisp, and there was nothing in the atmosphere to suggest that the day would deviate from their well-worn routine. The escalation began around mid-morning when the party reached a geographical feature locally referred to as a dry basin. As they crossed the rim of the basin, Condon and his companions reported a sudden and simultaneous shift in the environment. It wasn't a change in the weather, but rather a profound sensory suppression. The sound of the wind through the ponderosa pines, which had been constant and audible, vanished instantly. One witness later described it as if a heavy wool blanket had been draped over the entire landscape. The birds stopped calling, and even the sound of their own boots on the dry needles seemed muffled and distant. This phenomenon, often termed the cause effect in later research, created an immediate sense of unease. The men stopped in their tracks, looking at one another to confirm that they were all experiencing the same auditory vacuum. They weren't just hearing less. They felt as though the physical properties of the air had thickened, making movement feel sluggish and unnatural. As they stood in the center of the basin, the visual environment began to present anomalies that defied their collective knowledge of the area. The sunlight, which should have been casting long, sharp shadows from the south, appeared to become diffused and sourceless. There were no shadows on the planet. Condon checked his compass, a reliable military-grade instrument he had used for years. The needle did not spin wildly as one might expect in a fictionalized account. Instead, it remained fixed in a position that suggested north was toward the downhill slope of the basin, an orientation that the men knew for a fact was incorrect. They attempted to reorient themselves using the ridgeline, but the horizon seemed to shimmer and blur, making it impossible to fixate on a specific peak. The group decided to backtrack out of the basin immediately, feeling a rising sense of physical nausea and a pressure in their temples that felt like a localized atmospheric spike. The retreat out of the basin should have taken no more than 20 minutes. They were less than a quarter mile from the rim they had just crossed. However, as they climbed back toward the ridge, the terrain seemed to extend and warp. The men reported that they would walk toward a specific tree, only to find themselves several yards to the left or right of it without having turned. Time began to lose its linear quality for the group. Condon looked at his wristwatch, which showed 10:45 a.m. After what felt like an hour of strenuous climbing, he checked it again. The watch face read 10:47 a.m. Thinking the mechanism had failed, he asked another member of the party for the time. That man's watch had stopped entirely at 10:42 a.m. A third watch was running, but the second hand was moving at an erratic pace, sometimes skipping several seconds and then pausing. The sensation of being trapped in a loop of forest that refused to let them exit began to take a psychological toll, manifesting as a state of hypervigilance and irrational fear. By the time they finally broke through the tree line and reached the upper ridge, the environment returned to normal with a jarring suddenness. The sound of the wind rushed back into their ears, and the shadows reappeared on the ground. However, the shadows were now long and stretched toward the east. Condon looked at the sky and realized the sun was low on the horizon. When they finally managed to get a working timepiece to register, they discovered it was nearly 5:30 p.m. From their perspective, they had spent perhaps 45 minutes to an hour inside the basin and on the slope. In the world outside that specific geographic pocket, over 7 hours had passed. The men were physically exhausted, as if they had hiked 20 miles instead of 2, and their skin showed signs of mild radiation-like redness, despite the cool October temperatures and their heavy clothing. Upon returning to their base camp, the group found that the fire they had left banked in the morning was completely cold and dead, which was expected for a late afternoon return, but not for the midday return they had anticipated. Over the next 48 hours, the men experienced a series of physiological after effects that were documented by family members and later by local investigators. All 5 men reported severe headaches, a persistent metallic taste in their mouths, and a strange neurological symptom where they would experience brief flashes of light when closing their eyes. 2 of the men reported that their hair began to thin and fall out in small patches over the following weeks. The psychological impact was equally significant. They felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if the world they had returned to was subtly different from the one they had left, though they could not articulate exactly why or how. Word of the incident spread through the local community in Wallowa County, eventually catching the attention of regional researchers interested in unexplained phenomena. The men were interviewed separately to ensure their stories weren't being coordinated. The testimonies remained remarkably consistent. They described a specific zone where the laws of physics seemed to operate on a different cadence. They didn't report seeing crafts, beings, or typical paranormal entities. Instead, they described a localized failure of the environment itself. Some suggested that the basin might contain high concentrations of piezoelectric minerals that, under the right tectonic stress, could create powerful electromagnetic fields capable of affecting human perception and electronic devices. Others hypothesized that the area was a natural gravity well or a site of atmospheric lensing. None of these theories, however, fully accounted for the massive discrepancy in recorded time or the physical symptoms experienced by the witnesses. In the years following the 1974 event, other hunters and hikers began to come forward with similar, though less intense, reports from the same general area near the Imnaha River. These accounts often featured the same core elements: the sudden loss of ambient sound, the failure of compasses, and a confusing sense of missing time. Local forest rangers, while officially dismissive of paranormal claims, privately acknowledged that the basin was a place where people frequently became disoriented, even those with high-end GPS equipment in later decades. The area gained a quiet reputation as a spot to be avoided, not because of predators or terrain, but because of a perceived instability in the landscape itself. The Condon party never returned to that specific drainage, and several members of the group reportedly gave up hunting entirely, citing a permanent loss of confidence in their ability to trust their senses in the woods. The case of the Condon encounter remains an outlier because of the number of witnesses and the lack of any criminal or mundane explanation. There were no drugs involved, no history of mental instability among the men, and no clear motive for fabricating such a bizarre and specific story that brought them more ridicule than fame. The physical evidence, such as the synchronized watch failures and the strange skin irritations, suggested a genuine interaction with an external force, yet that force remained invisible and nameless. It wasn't an encounter with something in the woods, but rather an encounter with the woods themselves turning into something unrecognizable. The incident sits in the archives of Oregon's unexplained history as a reminder that even the most grounded individuals can find themselves in a situation where the fundamental structure of reality seems to fray at the edges. To this day, the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest continues to be a site of sporadic reports involving altered perception. Modern researchers have attempted to map the basin with drone technology, but reports of equipment malfunction and signal loss remain common in that specific sector. The trees there grow in odd, twisted patterns that some arborists suggest indicate a history of localized environmental stress, though the cause of that stress is never identified. The story of Robert Condon and his party serves as a foundational narrative for those who study the intersection of geography and the unexplained. It suggests that there are places on the map where time and space do not hold their shape, leaving those who wander into them to grapple with a version of the world that no longer follows the rules. The missing 7 hours of the 12th of October 1974 remain uncovered, a permanent gap in the lives of 5 men who simply went out to scout a ridge and came back to a world that had moved on without them. The legacy of the event is felt most strongly in the way it changed the local perception of the wilderness. It moved the forest from being a source of resources and recreation to being a place of potential existential hazard. The men involved largely retreated from the public eye, weary of the questions that had no answers. They lived out their lives with the knowledge that for one afternoon, they had stepped outside of the stream of time. The mystery isn't just what happened in that basin, but why it happened to them and why the Earth itself seemed to briefly reject their presence. It remains a chilling example of the non-human, non-criminal horrors that can manifest in the deep wild, where the only monster is the silence and the only weapon is a watch that has stopped ticking. As the decades have passed, the specific basin has become overgrown, the original trails reclaimed by the forest. Yet the data points from that day remain fixed in the records. The atmospheric pressure readings from nearby stations on that date showed no significant anomalies, and there were no reported seismic events in the region. The sun rose and set according to the celestial calendar, but for 5 men in a dry basin in Oregon, the sun stayed still while the hours vanished. This contradiction is the heart of the Condon incident. It is a story with no resolution, no villain, and no lesson, other than the uncomfortable realization that our understanding of the environment is based on a stability that may be more fragile than we care to admit. The woods are deep, the history is long, and somewhere in the Willowa Whitman, there is still a pocket of air that waits for the next person to step into its silence. The physical sensations described by the men, particularly the pressure in the temples and the metallic taste, align with modern understanding of high-frequency electromagnetic exposure, yet the source of such a field in a remote wilderness remains a subject of intense speculation. Some have suggested that the military may have been conducting clandestine tests in the region, but no records of such activities have ever been declassified or even hinted at by whistleblowers. The absence of a human culprit leaves only the landscape itself as the source of the anomaly. The Condon Party's experience has become a benchmark for what is known as a high strangeness event, where the primary threat is not a physical entity, but a fundamental shift in the environment that threatens the observer's sanity and physical well-being. It is a haunting that isn't about a ghost, but about a place that remembers a different set of laws. In the final analysis, the 1,974 Condon encounter stands as a testament to the reliability of eyewitness testimony when it is grounded in a lack of expectation. These were men who valued the tangible and the practical. Their struggle to describe what happened to them is perhaps the most convincing evidence of its reality. They didn't use the language of science fiction or the occult, they used the language of the woods, describing a forest that went quiet and a sun that wouldn't move. The simplicity of their account is what makes it endure. It is a narrative of 5 men who lost 7 hours and spent the rest of their lives wondering where those hours went and what, if anything, was watching them while they were gone. The Imnaha River continues to flow through the canyon, and the pines continue to grow on the ridges, but for those who know the story, the landscape is forever marked by the day the clock stood still. The lingering effects on the witnesses suggest that the encounter was more than just a psychological trick of the mind. The patches of hair loss and the neurological flashes point to a biological interaction with an energetic phenomenon that we still cannot fully categorize. This physical evidence elevates the case from a mere campfire story to a documented mystery of human physiology under extreme and unexplained conditions. When the men looked back at the ridge from the safety of their camp that night, they weren't looking at a familiar mountain range. They were looking at a gateway to something that didn't belong in their century. The isolation of the location ensured that there were no other witnesses to provide a different perspective, leaving the Condon Party as the sole narrators of a reality that should not exist. The basin itself remains a point of interest for those few who can find it. It is said that even on the windiest days, the center of that depression remains unnaturally still. The silence there is not the silence of peace, but the silence of an empty room where someone is expected to arrive. It is a localized anomaly that suggests the Earth has its own secrets, tucked away in the folds of the mountains, where the trees are thick and the light is thin. The 1974 incident didn't change the world, but it changed 5 men, and it left a permanent mark on the folklore of the American West. It serves as a reminder that the maps we draw are only approximations of a world that is far more complex and far more indifferent to our presence than we usually choose to believe. What makes the Condon encounter truly disturbing is the lack of a traditional climax. There was no confrontation with a beast and no grand revelation from a higher power. There was only the slow, grinding realization that the men were no longer in control of their own movement or their own time. This loss of agency is the core of the horror. It is the fear of being erased by the environment, of becoming a part of the silence that has swallowed so many others who have disappeared in the wilderness without a trace. The Condon party was lucky enough to walk back out, but they brought a piece of that silence back with them, quietness that stayed in their homes and in their conversations for the rest of their lives. The case remains open in the minds of those who study the fringes of our world, a stubborn fact that refuses to be explained away. Looking back at the archival reports from the mid-70s, one is struck by the earnestness of the reporting. The local papers didn't treat it as a joke or a sensationalist headline. They treated it as a serious concern for the safety of those using the national forest. The concern was that if the forest could swallow 7 hours, it could just as easily swallow a life. The investigation eventually hit a wall because there was nowhere else to go. Without a crime, there was no jurisdiction. Without a physical object, there was no evidence to analyze in a lab. There was only the testimony of 5 honest men and the cold, unmoving trees of the Wallowa Whitman. The incident faded from the news cycles, but never from the memory of the county, where it is still whispered about when the autumn air turns cold and the shadows begin to stretch. Ultimately, the story of the Condon encounter is a story about the limits of human perception. We are built to perceive time as a constant and space as a fixed stage. When those things fail, the result is a profound trauma that the mind struggles to process. Robert Condon and his companions didn't find a monster in the woods. They found a hole in the world. They fell into it for a few hours and then were spat back out, forever changed by the experience of seeing the machinery of the universe stall. The forest near the Imnaha River remains a beautiful, rugged, and dangerous place. But for those who have heard the account of the 1974 party, it is also a place where the ground might not be as solid as it looks, and the minutes might not be as long as they seem. The final unresolved element of the case is the question of what occurred during those 7 hours. If the men only perceived 45 minutes, where did their bodies go during the other 6 hours and 15 minutes? Were they standing still in the basin, invisible to the world, or were they moved somewhere else entirely? The physiological symptoms suggest they were subjected to a significant amount of energy, but the nature of that energy is a mystery. The missing time is a void that no amount of research has been able to fill. It remains a silent, dark space in the history of Oregon. A day when 5 men went into a basin and left a part of themselves behind in a time that didn't happen. The Devil's Punch Bowl Encounter. In the harsh, arid expanse of the Mojave Desert within Southern California, there is a geological formation known as the Devil's Punch Bowl, where vertical layers of sedimentary rock create a natural amphitheater of jagged stone. In late November 1995, a pair of experienced wilderness surveyors working on a contract to update topographical maps for regional land management reported an incident that fundamentally challenged their understanding of physical reality. 2 men, Elias Thorne and Marcus Reed, had spent weeks in the high desert and were well acquainted with the isolation and the optical tricks played by the shimmering desert heat. However, the events that unfolded over a period of 48 hours were not the result of dehydration or heat exhaustion, as the temperatures were unseasonably cool and their supplies were more than adequate. The disturbance began on a Tuesday afternoon while the pair was setting up a laser ranging station on a ridge overlooking the primary basin. As Reed attempted to calibrate the equipment, he noticed that the laser pulse, which should have traveled in a straight line to a reflector a mile away, appeared to curve visibly toward the center of the punch bowl. Thinking the instrument was damaged, he swapped it for a backup unit, only to witness the same impossible trajectory. At the same time, Thorne, who was recording coordinates in a field notebook, noticed that the shadows of the surrounding rock fins were moving at an accelerated rate. He watched as a shadow traveled 10 feet across the sand in what felt like 30 seconds, a movement that would normally take over an hour as the sun crossed the sky. The men stood in a vacuum of silence so absolute that the sound of their own heartbeats became a rhythmic thumping in their ears, drowning out the natural whistle of the desert wind. As the sun reached the horizon, the men decided to abandon their work and return to their vehicle parked 3 miles away. However, as they moved down the ridge, the geography of the basin seemed to fold in on itself. They found that every trail they took, regardless of the direction indicated by their military-grade compasses, led them back to the exact same cluster of twisted manzanita bushes near the basin floor. The compass needles did not spin. They remained stubbornly fixed on a point toward the center of the rocks, as if a massive, unseen magnetic force had anchored them there. By the time they realized they were trapped in a spatial loop, the sky had turned a deep, bruised purple, but no stars appeared. The overhead canopy remained a featureless, pitch-black void, devoid of the constellations they usually relied on for navigation. During the night, the temperature did not drop as it usually does in the high desert. Instead, the air grew increasingly humid and heavy, smelling of ozone and wet stone. While huddled near a small outcropping, the men witnessed a series of visual anomalies that they later described as shimmering panes in the air. These were vertical sections of the atmosphere that appeared to be reflecting a completely different landscape, one of lush, prehistoric greenery and towering ferns visible for only a few seconds before snapping back to the dry desert scrub. These windows into another environment were accompanied by a low-frequency vibration that rattled the surveyor's teeth and caused a persistent, metallic taste to coat their tongues. They reported a feeling of thinness, as if the physical barrier between their location and another point in time had become dangerously permeable. When dawn finally broke, it did so with a jarring suddenness. There was no gradual light. The sun simply appeared at a 30-degree angle in the sky as if it had been switched on. Thorne and Reed discovered that their watches, which had been synchronized the morning before, now showed a discrepancy of nearly 4 hours between them. More disturbingly, their skin was covered in a fine, silver-colored dust that could not be wiped away but seemed to be emanating from their pores. The equipment they had left on the ridge was found melted, not by heat, but as if the molecular bonds of the plastic and metal had been vibrated apart, leaving behind a pile of gray slag that retained the vague shape of the original tools. The men finally managed to exit the basin by walking backward, a desperate tactic Thorne suggested after noticing that the spatial distortion seemed to react to their forward intent. Once they reached the main road, they flagged down a passing park ranger. The ranger later noted in an unofficial log that the men appeared radiant, as if they were standing under a spotlight even in the shade. Medical evaluations conducted later that week revealed that both men had undergone a strange physiological change. Their bone density had increased significantly over the course of the 2-day ordeal, and their cellular aging appeared to have accelerated by several years. There was no evidence of foul play, no tracks of other individuals in the area, and no seismic activity recorded by the nearby San Andreas fault sensors that could explain the vibrations. The official report categorized the event as a geographic disorientation incident caused by localized atmospheric phenomena, a bureaucratic phrase that ignored the curved light, the prehistoric windows, and the physical transformation of the witnesses. The area around the Devil's Punch Bowl was briefly surveyed by a team from a local university, but they found nothing out of the ordinary. as the thinness appeared to have sealed itself. Thorne and Reed refused to return to the site and eventually moved away from the desert entirely, citing a permanent pull they felt whenever they looked toward the horizon. They lived the rest of their lives with a hypersensitivity to electromagnetic fields, claiming they could hear the hum of power lines from miles away. The case remains a staple of regional desert folklore, often whispered about among hikers and geologists who frequent the area. It is cited as a prime example of a vortex, or a thin place, where the rules of the physical world are temporarily suspended. Unlike sightings of lights in the sky or creatures in the brush, the Devil's Punch Bowl encounter was an encounter with the architecture of the world itself failing to hold its shape. The silver dust on their skin eventually faded, but the psychological impact remained. Both men described a feeling that they were no longer fully here, as if a part of their consciousness had remained trapped in that spatial world, forever watching the shadows move too fast across the sand. Today, the Punch Bowl remains a popular destination for tourists, most of whom see nothing more than impressive rock formations and beautiful vistas. Yet, there are still sporadic reports from solo hikers who claim to find themselves walking the same 100-yard stretch of trail for hours, or who find their digital watches have reset to a time that hasn't happened yet. The desert is a place of deep time and vast scale. And as the 1,995 incident suggests, it is a place where the boundaries of the present are not as firm as we might hope. The rocks of the Punch Bowl stand as silent witnesses to a reality that occasionally ripples, leaving those caught in the waves to struggle back to the shore of the known world. The mystery of the distorted laser and the curved shadows at the Devil's Punch Bowl serves as a chilling reminder that our maps are only as good as the physics they are built upon. When the light stops traveling in a straight line and the stars refuse to show themselves, the map becomes useless. Elias Thorne and Marcus Reed were men of measurements and facts, but they encountered something that could not be measured and a fact that could not be reconciled with the rest of their lives. They walked out of the desert, but the desert never truly let them go, leaving a permanent gap in their history and a lingering silver glow in their memories of the night the world folded. The Echoes of Blackwood Creek. In the late autumn of 2024, a team of 3 wilderness research scientists was conducting a long-term study on soil composition and geological stability in a remote, high-altitude section of the Australian Alps Site 1. The specific location was a jagged, unnamed ridge near the border of New South Wales and Victoria, an area characterized by ancient granite outcrops and extreme weather shifts, Site 1. The team was led by a geophysicist named Dr. Julian Thorne, who had spent decades mapping the tectonic signatures of the continent, Site 1. They were equipped with high-precision seismometers, satellite-linked data loggers, and traditional surveying tools, Site 1. On the afternoon of February 12, the environmental conditions on the ridge underwent a transformation that deviated from any recorded seismic or atmospheric event, Site 1. The disturbance began at approximately 4:15 p.m., when the team noticed a sudden, localized shift in the behavior of the horizon, Site 1. As they looked toward the west, the sun appeared to split into 3 distinct, identical spheres of light, each casting its own set of shadows across the granite Site 1. Thorne initially suspected a rare atmospheric refraction, or a parhelion, but the phenomenon did not dissipate with the changing angle of the sun, Site 1. Instead, the 3 suns remained fixed in the sky, even as the team's digital watches continued to track the passage of time to Site 1. The air grew unnaturally still, and the temperature, which had been a steady 28 degrees Celsius, plummeted to near freezing in less than 3 minutes, Site 1. As the team attempted to document the visual anomaly, they discovered that their physical coordination had been severely compromised, Site 1. One researcher, a technician named Leo, reported that his sense of weight had inverted, making it feel as though he were being pushed toward the sky while his feet remained glued to the ground, Site 1. This vestibular disorientation was accompanied by an auditory phenomenon that the men described as the sound of shattering glass echoing from the rocks beneath their feet, Site 1. When Thorne checked the seismometers, the displays showed no ground movement, yet the sound was so intense that it caused the team's water bottles to vibrate and crack, Site 1. The most disturbing aspect of the encounter occurred when the team tried to use their satellite phone to contact the base station, Site 1. The device connected instantly, but the voice on the other end was not the dispatcher. It was a recording of the team's own conversation from 3 hours prior, played back in a slow, distorted cadence that made the words sound like a foreign language, Site 1. This temporal feedback loop created a sense of profound isolation, as if they had been cut off from the linear flow of the world, Site 1. The ridge began to glow in a pale bioluminescent light that bled out of the granite fissures, illuminating the gray stone in shades of neon violet and electric blue, Site 1. During the height of the incident, the researchers witnessed what they termed ghost landscapes, Site 1. For brief intervals, the rocky ridge would vanish, replaced by a visual of a vast, shallow sea filled with bioluminescent organisms that moved with a rhythmic, pulsing motion, Site 1. These visions lasted only seconds before the granite snapped back into place, but the transition was so jarring that it caused the men to experience severe nausea and brief periods of blackouts, Site 1. Thorne reported seeing his own shadow move independently of his body, walking several paces ahead of him before dissolving into the violet light of the rocks, Site 1. By 8 p.m., the three suns finally merged back into a single setting orb, and the temperature surged back to its normal evening warmth, Site 1. The bioluminescence receded into the earth, and the sound of the shattering glass vanished, replaced by the familiar hum of the alpine wind, Site 1. However, when the team checked their data loggers, they found that the devices had recorded over 48 hours of data in the span of the 4-hour incident, Site 1. The soil samples they had collected earlier that day had been physically altered. The dark earth had turned into a fine white powder that possessed a high electrical charge, causing it to cling to any surface it touched, Site 1. The subsequent debriefing with the Research Institute led to the incident being classified as a localized atmospheric and magnetic anomaly, a label that failed to address the three suns, the inverted gravity, or the ghost landscapes, Site 1. The four men returned from the ridge with a permanent physiological change. They all developed a condition known as synesthesia, where they could see sounds and hear colors, a neurological shift that their doctors could not explain, Site 1. Leo, the technician, eventually left the field of geophysics entirely, claiming that he could no longer stand the sound of the earth thinking beneath his feet, Site 1. The mystery of the Red Peak dislocation remains a quiet anomaly in the records of the Australian Alps, Site 1. It is a case where the environment did not just present a haunting, but appeared to be running multiple versions of itself simultaneously, Site 1. The ridge is now avoided by local hikers who speak of a light that doesn't set and a silence that rings like glass, Site 1. The incident serves as a chilling reminder that our understanding of the planet is limited by our perception of time and light, Site 1. On that ridge, the Earth revealed that it remembers a different sky and a different sea. For 4 hours, it invited 4 men to witness a reality that should have remained buried in the deep time of the continent, Site 1. The environmental footprint left behind by the event continued to puzzle independent investigators who managed to access the site months later. The white powder found on the ridge floor was analyzed and found to have a crystalline structure that matched no known terrestrial mineral, Site 1. It appeared to be a form of quartz that had been subjected to extreme pressure and high-frequency vibrations simultaneously, Site 1. Furthermore, the granite outcrops themselves showed signs of microscopic fractures that radiated outward from a central point on the ridge, as if an invisible explosion of kinetic energy had occurred within the rock itself, Site 1. Despite these physical markers, there were no traces of chemical explosives, radiation, or any human-made technology at the scene, Site 1. Over time, the accounts provided by Thorne and his team were corroborated by sporadic reports from other hikers who had frequented the area in the years following the 2024 incident, Site 1. These witnesses often described a sudden, heavy silence that would descend upon the ridge, followed by a sensation of being out of sync with their own movement, Site 1. Some reported seeing faint, shimmering panes in the air that reflected landscapes that did not belong in the Australian Alps, such as thick, prehistoric jungles or vast, frozen tundras, Site 1. These reports were rarely taken seriously by official agencies, yet they formed a consistent pattern of high strangeness that pointed to the ridge being a permanent site of environmental instability, Site 1. The psychological impact on the survivors remained the most documented aspect of the case. Dr. Thorne, despite his professional background in geophysics, began to write extensively about the concept of geographic trauma, suggesting that certain landscapes possess a memory that can be violently replayed under specific atmospheric conditions, Site 1. He argued that the ridge was not haunted by ghosts of the dead, but by ghosts of the Earth's own history, Site 1. His theories were largely rejected by the scientific community, yet they found a following among those who study the intersection of geography and the unexplained, Site 1. The team members remained in contact, often meeting to discuss the persistent hum they could all still feel in their bones, a lingering resonance from the night the mountains spoke, Site 1. The case of the Red Peak dislocation stands as a testament to the limitations of current monitoring technology. The seismometers and satellite loggers were designed to measure known physical variables, but they were entirely unprepared for an event that operated outside of linear time and standard electromagnetic parameters, Site 1. The 48 hours of data recorded in a 4-hour window suggested a compression of the temporal field that current physics cannot adequately explain. Site 1. This discrepancy is the core of the mystery, a numerical proof that for a brief moment in the Australian wilderness, time was not a constant, Site 1. Today, the ridge remains an unnamed spot on the topographic maps of the Alpine National Park Site 1. The white powder has long since been washed away by the seasons, and the bleached vegetation has been replaced by new growth, Site 1. Yet, the memory of the three suns and the shattered glass sound continues to linger in the regional folklore, Site 1. It serves as a cautionary tale for those who believe that the wilderness is a static and predictable stage, Site 1. The Red Peak incident suggests that the Earth is a dynamic and perhaps even sentient entity capable of folding the present back into the past whenever it chooses, Site 1. The legacy of the event is a quiet one, recorded in the margins of professional journals and the private diaries of the men who lived through it, Site 1. There are no monuments on the ridge, and no tours are conducted to the site of the anomaly, Site 1. It remains a place of deep silence, guarding its secrets from those who would try to measure them, Site 1. For the researchers involved, the ridge was the place where their careers ended and their understanding of the world began anew, Site 1. They walked off that granite spine as different people, forever marked by the realization that the ground beneath their feet is not nearly as solid as it looks, Site 1. In the final analysis, the 2024 encounter is a reminder that the deep wild holds pockets of existence that operate on a different cadence, Site 1. The triple suns and the bioluminescent sea were not hallucinations, but a glimpse into a reality that usually remains hidden from human eyes, Site 1. The survivors live with the knowledge that the world is far older and more complex than our maps suggest, Site 1. The ridge of the sleeping suns continues to stand over the valley, waiting for the next time the atmospheric pressure and the magnetic fields align to open the door once again, Site 1. Until then, the silence of the Australian Alps remains unbroken, a cold and patient witness to the daytime stood still, Site 1. The echoes of Sentinel Pass. In the early autumn of 2019, a trio of experienced backcountry rangers was assigned to conduct a late-season wildlife census in a high-elevation corridor of the Canadian Rockies. The area, locally referred to as Sentinel Pass, is a desolate stretch of alpine tundra bounded by sheer limestone walls and permanent cascades. The team was led by a senior ranger named Sarah Miller, who had spent nearly 2 decades patrolling the jagged peaks of Alberta. They were equipped with standard satellite communication devices, high-fidelity audio recorders for capturing wolf howls, and precise topographic tools. On the third night of their patrol, the environmental conditions shifted into a state that challenged their fundamental understanding of the physical world. The disturbance began just after sunset while the rangers were establishing a bivouac on a flat granite shelf. Miller noticed that the stars, which should have been piercingly bright in the thin mountain air, appeared to be vibrating in place. This visual anomaly was accompanied by the sudden onset of a sound that the team described as a hollow, metallic ringing, similar to the strike of a distant hammer against an anvil. The ringing did not originate from any specific direction. It seemed to resonate from within the very bedrock beneath their sleeping pads. As the sound increased in volume, the rangers witnessed a localized distortion of the landscape. The limestone walls of the pass appeared to lose their solidity, shimmering like a reflection in a disturbed pool of water. As the rangers attempted to document the phenomenon, they discovered that their digital equipment was behaving erratically. The screens of their GPS units displayed a series of nonsensical characters, and the audio recorders began to play back sounds that had not yet occurred. Miller reported hearing the sound of her own voice discussing the next morning's breakfast, even though she had not spoken a word. This temporal feedback loop created an intense sense of psychological dislocation. One of the younger rangers, David, experienced a severe vestibular collapse, feeling as though the ground had tilted to a 45-degree angle, despite the shelf remaining perfectly level. The air around them grew heavy with the scent of ozone and scorched earth, and a fine, luminous mist began to seep from the cracks in the stone. During the height of the incident, the team reported seeing transparent echoes of themselves moving through the camp. These were not apparitions in the traditional sense, but blurred, low-resolution versions of their own bodies, performing mundane tasks, stoking the stove, checking the perimeter, or adjusting their packs. These figures moved at a different speed than the rangers, sometimes appearing to freeze in mid-motion before dissolving into the mist. Miller noted that when she tried to touch one of these echoes, her hand passed through a pocket of air that felt significantly colder and denser than the surrounding atmosphere. The ringing sound eventually peaked in a deafening harmonic chord that caused the rangers to lose consciousness simultaneously. When the team awoke at dawn, they found themselves not on the granite shelf, but in a small meadow over 2 miles away from their original camp. Their equipment was scattered around them, and their satellite phone had been physically altered. The plastic casing was now brittle and translucent, as if it had been subjected to decades of extreme UV exposure in a single night. Most disturbingly, their analog watches, which had been synchronized at the start of the patrol, were now hours apart. One watch had stopped entirely at 11:22 p.m. Another had skipped forward by 6 hours, and Miller's watch was running in reverse at double the normal speed. Despite the physical exertion required to move 2 miles while unconscious, none of the rangers showed any signs of physical trauma or exhaustion. The subsequent debriefing with regional park authorities led to a temporary closure of the Sentinel Pass corridor for environmental assessment. The official reports avoided any mention of temporal anomalies or visual echoes, instead focusing on potential pockets of high-altitude volcanic gases that might have caused collective hallucinations. However, no geological evidence of such gases was ever found. The 3 rangers were reassigned to lower elevation districts and were discouraged from discussing the event publicly. Miller later noted that she had returned from the mountain with a strange biological marker. Her hair had turned completely white in several patches, a change that her physician could not attribute to any known stress or medical condition. The incident at Sentinel Pass remains a quiet mystery within the Canadian Park Service, documented primarily through the conflicting logs of the rangers involved. It is a case where the horror was not derived from a malevolent entity, but from the sudden, cold realization that the environment is not a static stage. The mountains appeared to have momentarily reset their own history, dragging the rangers into a fracture where past, present, and future were no longer distinct. While the pass is now open again to the public, few hikers venture there after dark, and those who do often report a lingering sense of being out of sync with their own movements. To this day, the mechanical ringing of Sentinel Pass is whispered about by local guides who avoid the granite shelf during the autumn equinox. The mystery of the glowing mist and the reverse-running watches remains a permanent question mark in the annals of the Alberta wilderness. It serves as a reminder that the deep wild does not always follow the linear rules of human civilization. The limestone peaks stand as silent sentinels over a place where time once failed, leaving behind only the bleached gear of a ranger team and the memory of a world that turned to glass and echoes for a single, impossible night. The echoes of the Nahanni Valley. In the far reaches of the Northwest Territories in Canada, the South Nahanni River carves a path through deep canyons and jagged mountain ranges that have remained largely inaccessible to the modern world. By the early 20th century, the region had already developed a reputation for being a place where the laws of nature felt slightly askew, characterized by high thermal activity and dense mists that often clung to the valley floor even in the height of summer. Local oral traditions and the stories of early explorers spoke of a landscape that was physically demanding, but it was the sensory experiences of those who ventured into the interior that began to form a pattern of documented unease. Observers often remarked on a crushing sense of being watched from the tree line, an experience that transcended simple predatory anxiety and entered the realm of a persistent, localized psychological weight. This environment set the stage for a series of events involving a group of surveyors and prospectors who found themselves documenting more than just the topography of the land. During a routine mapping expedition in the mid-1900s, a small team established a base camp near the confluence of the river and a secondary creek. The men were seasoned outdoorsmen, accustomed to the isolation of the Canadian wilderness and the typical sounds of the forest. However, within the first week of their stay, the logs began to reflect a shift in the atmosphere of the camp. It started with the silence. In most wilderness areas, the night is filled with the movement of small mammals, the rustle of wind through pine needles, or the distant calls of owls. In this specific stretch of the valley, the men reported nights of absolute vacuum-like silence, where even the sound of the flowing river seemed muffled and distant. They described it as a sensory deprivation that made their own heartbeats feel uncomfortably loud, creating a heightened state of alertness that prevented restorative sleep. By the 10th day, the reports moved from the absence of sound to the presence of an inexplicable auditory stimuli. Several members of the party independently reported hearing rhythmic thudding sounds coming from the dense brush surrounding their perimeter. When they investigated with lanterns, they found no broken branches, no tracks in the soft moss, and no evidence of large fauna like moose or bears. The thudding didn't sound like footsteps. It was described as a heavy, vibrating pulse that seemed to emanate from the ground itself rather than a specific point on the horizon. This vibration was often accompanied by a sudden, localized drop in temperature that didn't match the general weather patterns of the evening. The men began to sleep in shifts, not out of fear of animals, but because of a collective intuition that the environment was reacting to their presence in a way they couldn't rationally categorize. One particular evening, a lead surveyor documented a visual phenomenon that remains one of the most detailed accounts of light distortion in the valley. While sitting by the dying embers of the campfire, he observed a series of pale, translucent pillars of light rising from the surface of the water. These weren't the northern lights, which were familiar to everyone in the group. These lights were stationary, vertical, and appeared to have a solid geometry to them. As he watched, the other men woke up and witnessed the same thing. They noted that the pillars didn't cast a reflection on the water's surface, a physical impossibility that suggested the phenomenon was an optical illusion or a localized distortion of light waves. They watched the pillars for nearly 20 minutes before the lights simply blinked out of existence, leaving the valley in a darkness that felt heavier than before. The escalation of these events led to a breakdown in the team's objective focus. The task of mapping became secondary to the task of managing a growing sense of spatial disorientation. Members of the team reported that distances between known landmarks seemed to change from day to day. A rock formation that was a 10-minute walk from camp one morning would take 30 minutes to reach the next, despite the terrain remaining identical. This was not attributed to poor navigation, as these were professional mappers using high-grade instruments. Instead, they described it as if the landscape were expanding or contracting, a fluidity of space that made them feel as though they were walking through a dream state. This distortion extended to their perception of time. Men would head out for what they believed was an hour-long scout, only to return 4 or 5 hours later, surprised to find the sun setting. The psychological strain reached a peak when the group's cook reported a series of interactions with what he perceived as a presence just outside the light of his cooking fire. He didn't see a figure, but he described the air as becoming thick and hard to breathe, accompanied by a high-pitched humming sound that caused physical nausea. He claimed that during these moments, the shadows of the trees didn't align with the position of the moon. He pointed out to his colleagues that the shadows were stretching toward the light source rather than away from it. While some dismissed this as a symptom of exhaustion and the play of flickering firelight, the consistency of his claims and the visible distress he exhibited forced the group to consider that the valley was exerting a physical influence on their sensory organs. Interviews conducted with regional guides later suggested that these experiences were not unique to this mapping team. There are numerous accounts in the provincial archives of travelers experiencing a phenomenon known as the third man factor, where a lone hiker feels the undeniable presence of another person walking directly behind them. In the South Nahani, however, this wasn't just a feeling of companionship, it was described as a predatory stalking. Witnesses often spoke of seeing movement in their peripheral vision, large gray shapes that blurred into the fog the moment they were looked at directly. These shapes never left tracks, never made noise, and never interacted with the physical environment, leading some to theorize that they were shadows cast by objects that weren't visible to the human eye, or perhaps a form of localized mirage caused by the valley's unique magnetic properties. As the team prepared to leave the area, they documented one final incident that solidified their decision to never return. While packing the riverboats, the entire group heard a voice calling out from the opposite bank. The voice was clear and sounded exactly like one of the team members who was currently standing right next to them. It repeated a specific phrase used during their morning briefings, word for word, with the same inflection and tone. The man whose voice was being mimicked was visibly shaken, as he hadn't spoken a word in several minutes. The group looked across the river, but saw only the dense, impenetrable wall of spruce trees. There was no echo, as the sound didn't bounce. It originated from a single point in the woods and then stopped abruptly. They pushed off into the current and didn't stop rowing until they were miles downstream, away from the narrow corridors of the canyon. The aftermath of the expedition left the participants with more questions than answers. Upon returning to civilization, their geological samples and topographical notes were found to be accurate and unremarkable, but their personal journals told a story of a reality that had begun to fray at the edges. One member of the team spent years researching the history of the Nahani, finding that the thermal springs in the area could potentially release gases that caused mild hallucinations or spatial distortion. However, this theory didn't account for the collective nature of the sightings or the consistency of the light pillars and the vocal mimicry. The geological records indicate that the valley sits on a complex series of fault lines and limestone caverns, which some physicists suggest could create electromagnetic anomalies capable of interfering with human brainwaves and visual perception. The mystery of the valley remains unresolved to this day. While the area is now part of a national park, the sheer scale and ruggedness of the terrain mean that much of it remains unmonitored. Modern hikers occasionally report similar feelings of being followed or experiencing strange gaps in their memory of certain trail segments. The official stance remains that these are the results of the physical toll of high-altitude hiking and the psychological effects of extreme isolation. Yet, for those who have spent time in the deep canyons of the South Nahanni, the explanation feels incomplete. They speak of a place where the air feels ancient and heavy, where the light doesn't always behave according to the rules of physics, and where the silence is a presence in its own right. The valley continues to be a point of interest for those studying the intersection of geology and human perception, a real-world location where the environment itself seems to hold a memory of things that cannot be explained. In looking back at the 1900s expedition, the most striking element isn't the fear the men felt, but the clinical way they tried to document their descent into the unknown. They were men of science and industry, not given to flights of fancy or belief in the supernatural. Their records were an attempt to categorize the impossible, to fit the bending of time and the mimicry of voices into a framework they could understand. The fact that they failed to do so highlights the limitations of modern observation when faced with a landscape that operates on its own hidden logic. The Nahanni Valley stands as a reminder that there are still corners of the world where the map is not the territory, and where the experience of the individual remains the only true record of a reality that refuses to be tamed or fully understood by those who pass through it. The legacy of these reports has influenced the way researchers approach the study of unexplained phenomena in the Canadian North. Rather than looking for ghosts or monsters, the focus has shifted toward the environmental triggers that might cause the human mind to perceive the world in such a distorted fashion. Is it possible that the limestone structures of the valley act as a massive recording device for sound and light, replaying events under certain atmospheric conditions? Or is there a more fundamental shift in the magnetic field that disrupts the way we process time and space? Whatever the cause, the incidents in the South Nahanni remain a documented part of the region's history, a collection of testimonies from credible witnesses who found themselves in a place where the world they knew had temporarily ceased to exist. The valley keeps its secrets behind walls of mist and rock, leaving only the echoes of those who were brave enough to listen. Even decades later, the journals from that specific mapping trip are kept in private collections, serving as a warning and a curiosity. The men involved mostly moved on to other work, but none of them ever returned to the Northwest Territories. They often spoke in later years of a lingering feeling of displacement, as if a part of their consciousness had remained trapped in that silent, shifting canyon. This lingering effect suggests that the encounters weren't just fleeting moments of confusion, but events that fundamentally altered their perception of the natural world. The South Nahanni River continues its slow erosion of the stone, indifferent to the humans who try to name its peaks or chart its course, remaining a vast, dark mirror reflecting the deepest anxieties of the people who wander into its depths. The story of the valley is not one of a haunting in the traditional sense, but of a landscape that is perhaps too vast and too old for the human mind to ever truly inhabit without losing its grip on the familiar. The records indicate that the thermal activity in the valley has remained consistent, with warm pockets of air creating microclimates that support lush vegetation surrounded by subarctic conditions. This stark contrast often leads to the sudden fog banks that witnesses claim precede the most intense experiences. Scientists have noted that these conditions can create superior mirages where objects below the horizon are projected into the sky, potentially explaining some of the light pillars and strange shapes. Yet, the auditory mimicry and the shared sensation of a physical presence remain outside the reach of these explanations. The consistency across different groups of people, separated by decades, suggests a recurring environmental trigger that science has yet to fully isolate. The valley remains a laboratory of the unexplained, a place where the physical and the perceived overlap in ways that challenge the boundaries of our understanding. Ultimately, the incidents in the Nahanni Valley represent a specific type of horror, one that comes from the realization that the world is much larger and more indifferent than we realize. It is the horror of the silence that doesn't end, the shadow that moves toward the light, and the voice that sounds like your own, coming from a place where no one should be. It is a documented history of unease that requires no monsters to be effective, only the vast, cold reality of the wilderness and the fragile nature of human perception. The archives of the Northwest Territories hold these stories as part of the land's heritage, a testament to the fact that some places are not meant to be mapped and some experiences are not meant to be explained, only remembered by those who survived the encounter with the unknown. As the sun sets over the Mackenzie Mountains today, the same mists likely roll into the canyons of the South Nahanni, and the same silence likely descends upon the riverbanks. The geological forces that created the valley continue to churn beneath the surface, and the magnetic anomalies continue to flicker in the dark. For the modern observer, these stories serve as a bridge to a time when the world still felt mysterious and dangerous, a time when a simple mapping expedition could turn into a journey into the heart of a spatial and temporal labyrinth. The valley remains there, ancient and unreachable in its deepest parts, waiting for the next group of witnesses to try and find their way through its shifting terrain and silent woods, where the only thing certain is the uncertainty of the experience itself.